The evening began like so many others in the past few weeks. Brian sat alone in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, his eyes unfocused on the TV screen. It had become his routine, a way to numb the growing unease that had settled into his bones. Susan had been distant lately, always glued to her phone, laughing at messages she never shared with him. She'd mentioned Kevin, this new guy from work, in passing, how funny he was, how good he was at his job. At first, Brian brushed it off. They'd been married for 18 years, and he trusted her. But something had shifted. Brian remembered the night it all began. About a month ago, Susan had come home late, her cheeks flushed and eyes sparkling in a way he hadn't seen in years. She mentioned an office happy hour, a casual get-together. Kevin organized it, she had said, with a little too much enthusiasm. He's really good at bringing people together. Brian had smiled, but something in her tone made him uneasy. Sounds like a fun guy, he had replied, trying to sound casual. But as the weeks went on, Kevin's name seemed to pop up in every conversation. Susan started dressing up more for work, wearing the perfume Brian had bought her last Christmas, the one she used to save for special occasions. Then came the night she invited Kevin over for dinner. Brian had agreed, wanting to meet the man his wife couldn't stop talking about. But Kevin canceled last minute. Something came up, Susan had said, too quickly, her disappointment palpable. Brian had watched her text him back, her fingers flying across the screen, and felt a pang of jealousy that he couldn't shake. The tension had only grown from there. Susan began spending more time at work, coming home late with excuses that felt increasingly flimsy. Brian tried to confront her about it once, but she brushed him off. "You're being paranoid, Brian," she had said, laughing it off. "Kevin's just a friend. You have nothing to worry about." But Brian did worry. He worried because he could see the changes in her. The way she'd light up when a message came through, the way she'd retreat to the bedroom to talk on the phone where he couldn't hear her. He tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, that the woman he had loved for nearly a decade wouldn't betray him. But doubt had a way of creeping in, seeping into the cracks of their marriage until it was all he could think about. Tonight, though, felt different. When Susan came down the stairs, dressed to the nines, her hair perfectly styled, Brian knew something was wrong. She looked more like the woman he had first met than the wife who had grown distant over the past few months. "Babe, Kevin is waiting in the car." Susan's voice broke through his thoughts, jarring him back to the present. She was by the front door now, checking her reflection in the mirror one last time. "Let's go. I'll introduce you two before we head out." Brian felt a surge of anger rise within him. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't even known she was going out tonight. His grip on the whiskey glass tightened as he stared at her reflection. "Kevin?" he repeated, his voice low and strained. "The Kevin you've been talking about nonstop for weeks? The Kevin who's so important that you have to go out with him on a Saturday night?" Susan turned to face him, rolling her eyes as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Brian, don't be ridiculous. Kevin's just a friend from work. You know that. We're going to a wild night, just for fun, and I thought it would be nice if you two met before we left." She grabbed her purse from the side table, clearly impatient to leave. Brian stood up slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the blood rushing to his face, his vision narrowing as he took in the sight of his wife, dressed up for another man. "If he sets foot in my driveway, I'll make sure he leaves in an ambulance," he said, each word laced with a cold fury. "And if you leave with him, don't bother coming back. You'll regret it for the rest of your life." Susan paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob as she processed his words. For a brief moment, Brian thought he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She shook her head, her expression hardening. "Stop being so dramatic, Brian. You're overreacting." Her voice was dismissive, as if this was just another petty argument she couldn't be bothered with. She opened the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she stepped outside. "I'll be back later. Don't wait up," she added over her shoulder, before closing the door behind her with a finality that sent a chill down Brian's spine. For a long moment, Brian stood there, staring at the closed door, his mind racing. The silence in the house was deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Susan had chosen Kevin over him, had walked out the door without a second thought, despite his warning. The sound of a car door slamming outside snapped Brian out of his daze. He rushed to the window just in time to see Susan laughing as she climbed into the passenger seat of Kevin's car. They didn't even look back at the house as they drove away, leaving Brian standing there, seething with rage and disbelief. Brian's fists clenched at his sides as he watched the taillights disappear down the street. His mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, humiliation, and anger. He couldn't just stand by and let this happen. He had warned her that there would be consequences. And now, as the reality of her betrayal set in, he felt a cold, calculated determination settle over him. "She thinks this is a game," Brian muttered to himself, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She has no idea what she's just done." He turned away from the window, his mind already working on what he needed to do next. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about making sure that Susan and Kevin paid for what they had done. Brian wasn't going to be the fool who let his wife walk all over him. No, this was going to be different. He was going to take control, and they were going to regret ever thinking they could betray him. Susan's heels clicked against the driveway as she stepped out of the taxi, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the front yard. She fumbled in her purse for her keys, feeling the dull throb of a hangover from the night before. The night had been a blur of drinks, wild things, loud music, and Kevin's voice in her ear, but now, the euphoria had faded, replaced by a gnawing unease. As she unlocked the front door and pushed it open, she was greeted by an unusual stillness. The house was dark, the curtains drawn, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Normally, Brian would be up by now, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, the smell of toast wafting through the air. But today, the house was silent. "Brian?" Susan called out, her voice echoing in the quiet. She hesitated in the doorway, half expecting him to emerge from around the corner, still fuming from their argument the night before. But there was no response, only the creaking of the floorboards as she stepped inside. She made her way to the kitchen, hoping to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over her. She opened the fridge, intending to grab some juice, but instead, she was met with an empty, sterile space. No milk, no eggs, nothing. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Brian always kept the fridge stocked. "Brian!" she called out again, louder this time, but the silence was unbroken. Pushing down the rising unease, Susan moved to the pantry, only to find it as barren as the fridge. She opened a few cabinets, her movements becoming more frantic, but everywhere she looked, there was nothing. A cold knot of fear began to form in her stomach. She moved quickly to the bedroom, her pulse quickening with every step. When she reached the closet and slid open the doors, her breath caught in her throat. Brian's side was empty, completely cleared out. His suits, his shoes, even the old college sweatshirt he never wore but refused to throw away. It was all gone. Susan's heart pounded as she rushed to the bathroom. The cabinet was bare, the counter wiped clean of any trace of him. She ran to the garage, hoping against hope that maybe he had just gone out, maybe she was overreacting. But his car was gone too. Panic gripped her as she stumbled back into the living room, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She dialed Brian's number, praying he would pick up, that this was some kind of joke. But the call went straight to voicemail. "Brian, what the hell is going on? Where are you? Call me back." Her voice trembled as she ended the call and immediately tried again, but it was the same voicemail. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. This wasn't just a simple argument gone too far. Brian had left, completely. But why? What had she missed? They had fought before, even had some serious arguments, but he had never done anything like this. Susan's breath came in shallow gasps as she opened her banking app. Maybe this was all some misunderstanding. But as soon as she saw the balance on their joint account, her blood ran cold. Zero. Every cent was gone. She checked the savings account, the emergency fund, even the investments. Everything was empty. "No, no, no," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the transaction history. It was all there, clear as day. Over the past few hours, every account had been drained. Wire transfers to accounts she didn't recognize, withdrawals from ATMs she had never used. Brian had done this. He had emptied everything. Susan stumbled backward, sinking onto the couch as the full weight of what was happening crashed down on her. She tried calling Brian again, but it was no use. She left a voicemail this time, her voice breaking. "Brian, please, just call me. I don't understand what's going on. We can talk about this. Please." She dropped the phone onto the coffee table and buried her face in her hands. She tried to think, to figure out what she was supposed to do next. The house was in her name, but with no money, she wouldn't be able to make the next mortgage payment. The bills were piling up on the kitchen counter, unopened and unpaid. She had always relied on Brian to handle the finances. Now, she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that had been a mistake. The hours ticked by, the sunlight creeping across the floor as Susan sat in the silent house, her thoughts spiraling. She tried to reach out to friends, but no one answered. Everyone was busy, caught up in their own lives. Kevin was the last person she wanted to call, but desperation drove her to dial his number. The phone rang a few times before going to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. It wasn't until the afternoon that it finally hit her. Brian had made good on his threat. She remembered his words from the night before, the cold anger in his eyes as he said, "If you leave with him, don't bother coming back. You'll regret it for the rest of your life." A sob escaped her lips as the reality sank in. Brian had meant every word. He hadn't just left. He had erased himself from their life, taking everything with him. She was alone, with nothing but the empty shell of their home and the crushing realization that she had pushed him too far. Susan's phone buzzed on the table, a notification flashing on the screen. It was an email from her credit card company, alerting her to a declined transaction. She hadn't even realized she had maxed it out. She looked around the empty house, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. How had it come to this? She thought back to the beginning of their relationship, the way Brian used to look at her with such love, the way they had built their life together. How had she let it slip away? The answer was painfully clear now, but it was too late to fix it. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Susan's eyes welled with tears as she realized the full extent of what she had lost. The house was just the beginning. Without Brian, everything would crumble. She could already feel the walls closing in on her, the life they had built together collapsing around her. She had no idea where he was, no idea how to find him, and no idea how to fix what she had broken. She sat there for hours, the sun setting outside, casting long shadows across the floor. The house, once filled with warmth and love, felt like a prison now, a silent, empty reminder of the life she had destroyed. And as the darkness closed in, Susan realized that Brian was right. She would regret this for the rest of her life. The days after Brian's disappearance blurred together, each one blending into the next as Susan grappled with the void he left behind. She wandered through the empty house, her steps echoing in the silence, trying to make sense of the wreckage of her life. The once comforting walls now felt like a cage, suffocating her as the reality of her situation set in. Susan started with the basics. She called Brian's workplace, thinking he might have sought refuge in the familiarity of his job. The receptionist, after a long pause, informed her that Brian had taken an indefinite leave of absence. The words hit Susan like a punch to the gut. Brian had planned this. He had made arrangements, prepared for his disappearance, while she had been oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Did he say where he was going? Susan asked, her voice wavering. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have that information," the receptionist replied, her tone distant, as if she was used to delivering bad news. He didn't provide any details, just that he wouldn't be back for a while. Susan hung up the phone, her hand trembling. She tried calling Brian's phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. She left another message, though she knew it was pointless. "Brian, please, just talk to me. We can figure this out together." But the emptiness on the other end of the line was all she received in return. Panic began to set in as the days passed with no word from Brian. Susan called their mutual friends, hoping someone might have heard from him, but each conversation ended in disappointment. "I haven't seen Brian," one friend said. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," Susan lied, forcing a smile through the phone. "Just haven't heard from him in a while." Thought maybe he was hanging out with you guys. But the concern in their voices only deepened her anxiety. No one had seen or heard from Brian since the night he disappeared. The first real blow came when Susan received a letter in the mail, a notice of foreclosure. She ripped open the envelope, her eyes scanning the words in disbelief. The mortgage payment had bounced, and the bank was now moving to reclaim the house. "This can't be happening," she muttered, her fingers gripping the paper tightly, but it was real. The house she had called home for years was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Susan tried to salvage what she could. She went to the bank, hoping to speak with someone who might understand her situation, but all she got was a cold reminder that her accounts were empty. "There's nothing we can do," the banker told her, his tone void of sympathy. "The payments are overdue, and without the funds, we can't reverse the process." The next shock came when she discovered the other car missing from the driveway. Susan stared at the empty space, her heart racing. She frantically called the police, thinking it had been stolen, but they informed her that the vehicle had been repossessed. "It was in your husband's name," the officer explained. "He must have defaulted on the loan." Susan's mind reeled as the pieces of her life fell apart one by one. The bills piled up on the kitchen counter, each one demanding payment she couldn't make. Her credit cards were maxed out, leaving her with no way to cover even the basics. The utilities were next, first the electricity, then the water, each shut off in turn as she failed to make the payments. Desperation clawed at her, and she turned to the only person she thought might help, Kevin. She hesitated before calling him, her pride warring with her need for assistance. When she finally did, his voice on the other end was distant, almost cold. "Kevin, I need your help," Susan said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Things are bad. Brian's gone. The house is being foreclosed, and I have no money. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause before Kevin responded. "Susan, I'm sorry you're going through this, but I can't get involved." "What do you mean you can't get involved?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "I thought we were—" "This is your problem, not mine," Kevin cut her off, his tone firm. "I didn't sign up for this mess. I've got my own life to deal with. You need to figure this out on your own." The line went dead before she could say anything else. Susan stared at her phone in disbelief, her last hope slipping away. She had never felt so alone. In the days that followed, Susan's search for Brian grew more frantic. She drove around town, visiting the places he used to go. The coffee shop where they had their first date, the park where he liked to run, but there was no sign of him. She even tried the house of an old friend of his, but it was a dead end. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. Each day, Susan's anxiety deepened. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, the once familiar spaces now suffocating her with their emptiness. She barely slept, her nights spent tossing and turning, haunted by thoughts of where Brian might be and what he might be doing. The financial strain was overwhelming, and with Kevin having distanced himself, there was no one she could turn to. The foreclosure process moved quickly. A notice appeared on the front door, giving her 30 days to vacate. Susan stared at it in disbelief, tears welling up in her eyes. This was her home, the place where she had built her life with Brian. Now, it was being taken from her, just like everything else. The final blow came when her phone rang late one night. She answered, hoping it was Brian, but it was a cold, mechanical voice on the other end, an automated message from the credit card company. Her last card had been declined, and the balance was now overdue. She threw the phone across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall, but it didn't make her feel any better. Susan sat on the floor, surrounded by the debris of her life, and realized just how far she had fallen. She had lost everything. Her home, her husband, her financial security, and there was no one to blame but herself. The life she had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As the days dragged on, Susan grew more desperate. She scoured social media, trying to find any trace of Brian, but he had deleted his accounts. She checked their bank statements, hoping for some clue, but there was nothing. It was as if Brian had erased himself from her life completely, leaving her to deal with the consequences of her choices. And so, Susan found herself alone, with no money, no home, and no hope. She had betrayed the one person who had always been there for her, and now she was paying the price. The storm she had set in motion had finally caught up with her, and there was no escape from the destruction it had wrought. Weeks later, Susan was sitting on the floor of her nearly empty house, surrounded by the few belongings she hadn't sold to keep herself afloat. The once vibrant home now felt like a hollow shell. The foreclosure deadline loomed closer, and she had no idea where she would go once the house was gone. Every call she made to Brian went unanswered, every text left on read. Her attempts to find him had been fruitless, and she was losing hope that she ever would. Then, late one evening, her phone buzzed with a message. Susan scrambled to grab it, her heart racing as she saw Brian's name flash on the screen. The message was brief, almost cold. "Meet me at the Pine Lodge Motel, 8 p.m. No explanation, no apology, just a location and a time. Susan stared at the message, a mix of relief and dread washing over her. She knew the motel, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that she wouldn't have even glanced at before. But now, it was her only link to Brian, her only chance to understand why he had done this to her. As the clock ticked toward 8 p.m., Susan went to the Pine Lodge Motel, the neon sign flickering above her like a dying flame. The place looked even worse in person. Faded paint, broken windows, and an air of neglect that hung heavy in the air. Brian was sitting in a rickety chair outside one of the rooms, his posture relaxed as if he hadn't a care in the world. He watched her approach with an expression she couldn't read, his face calm, almost serene. It was a stark contrast to the man she had last seen, full of rage and hurt. Susan's steps faltered as she neared him. "Brian," she began, her voice quivering. "Where have you been? Why did you do this? You ruined everything." The words tumbled out of her, a mix of accusation and desperation. Brian didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. Then slowly, he stood up from the chair, his movements deliberate. "I warned you, Susan," he said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "I told you that if you left with him, you'd regret it for the rest of your life." Susan's breath caught in her throat. She had replayed that night over and over in her mind, but hearing Brian's calm reminder now sent a shiver down her spine. She stammered, struggling to find the right words. "I didn't think you meant this." She gestured vaguely around them, as if that could encompass the enormity of what had happened. Brian took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "What did you think would happen, Susan? That you could betray me and walk away without any consequences?" His voice remained calm, but there was a steeliness to it that made Susan's heart pound in her chest. "It wasn't like that," she tried to explain, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, but we can work through this. We can fix it." Brian's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "There's no fixing this, Susan." His words were final, like a door slamming shut. "You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." "Brian, please," Susan pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, I am. I know I hurt you, but we can find a way back. We've been through so much together." She reached out, trying to grasp his hand, but Brian stepped back, putting more distance between them. "You don't get it, do you?" Brian's voice was tinged with something darker now, a bitterness that Susan had never heard from him before. "This isn't about just moving on. This is about understanding what you did and what it cost. Not just for me, but for you." Susan felt tears prick at her eyes, her vision blurring as she looked at the man she had once loved, the man she still loved. "Brian, I'm begging you," she whispered. "We can start over. Just come home." Brian shook his head slowly, a sad smile playing on his lips. "There's no home to go back to, Susan. You burned it down the moment you walked out that door with him." The words cut through her like a knife, sharp and painful. She had known, deep down, that things could never be the same, but hearing it from Brian made it all too real. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "That's not my problem anymore." The coldness in his voice was a stark contrast to the warmth he had once shown her, the love that had once filled their home. "You wanted to live your life without me. Now you have it." Susan felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her entire world crumbling around her. "Please," she tried one last time, desperation clawing at her insides. "Just tell me what I can do to make this right." Brian's eyes softened, just for a moment, but then he shook his head again. "There's nothing you can do, Susan. It's over." He turned away, walking back toward the door of the motel room, his back to her. Susan stood there, frozen, watching him go. "Brian, wait," she called out, but he didn't stop. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving her standing alone in the dim light of the parking lot. For a long time, she didn't move, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The man she had known, the life she had built with him, was gone, leaving only an empty shell behind. She had lost him, and in doing so, she had lost herself. Eventually, Susan turned and walked back. The realization of what she had lost, what she had thrown away, hit her all at once, and she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Brian had given her a choice that night, and she had made the wrong one. Now, she was left to face the consequences, alone and broken. The life she had known was gone, and there was no going back. Every morning, Susan woke up hoping that it had all been a bad dream, that Brian would be there beside her, and that they could somehow find a way to mend what had been broken. But each day, reality greeted her with the stark reminder that Brian was truly gone, and she was left to face the consequences of her choices alone. With nowhere else to turn, Susan threw herself into work, hoping to find solace in the one thing she still had control over. But even that proved to be a hollow refuge. Her colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now treated her with a cold professionalism that only deepened her sense of loneliness. She could see the judgment in their eyes, the silent accusations that followed her down the hallways. Her performance at work began to suffer. The stress of losing everything, coupled with the guilt that gnawed at her insides, made it impossible to focus. She missed deadlines, fumbled through meetings, and made mistakes that were out of character. It wasn't long before her superiors noticed, and the whispers of dissatisfaction reached her ears. One day, after yet another sleepless night, Susan was called into her boss's office. She walked in, her stomach in knots, knowing that the conversation was going to be painful. Her boss, a stern woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, didn't waste time getting to the point. "Susan, your work has been slipping," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I know you're going through a tough time, but we can't afford to have you at less than your best. I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." The words hit Susan like a physical blow, and for a moment, she was too stunned to respond. "Please," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need a little more time. I'll do better, I promise." But her boss shook her head, her expression resolute. "I'm sorry, Susan, but we've already made our decision. You'll receive a severance package, and I'm sure you'll land on your feet soon. But your last day is today." Susan left the office in a daze, her severance paperwork clutched in her trembling hands. The realization that she was now both jobless and homeless crashed over her like a wave, and she felt as if she were drowning in despair. The foreclosure process moved quickly, and within weeks, Susan was forced to leave the home that had once been her sanctuary. She packed what little she had left into a few suitcases and drove away, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had no destination, no place to call her own. She checked into a cheap motel, the kind of place she had once looked down on, and spent her days staring at the walls, trying to figure out how her life had spiraled so far out of control. The silence was oppressive, and the loneliness suffocating. She thought about reaching out to Brian again, but the memory of their last encounter held her back. She knew he wouldn't respond, and even if he did, what could she possibly say to undo the damage she had done? Meanwhile, Brian's life had taken a different turn. Freed from the weight of a broken marriage, he found himself rediscovering the simple pleasures of life. He moved to a small town far away from the memories of his old life, where he could start fresh. He rented a modest apartment and found a job that allowed him to pursue his passion for woodworking, a hobby he had long neglected during the years of his tumultuous marriage. Brian's days were filled with peace and satisfaction as he crafted furniture in his workshop, the rhythmic sound of sanding and sawing a soothing balm for his wounded soul. He made new friends, people who knew nothing of his past and who accepted him for who he was in the present. For the first time in years, Brian felt truly content, free from the lies and betrayals that had plagued his marriage. Susan, on the other hand, struggled to rebuild her life. She took on menial jobs to make ends meet, working long hours for little pay. Each day was a battle against the crushing weight of regret, and each night was spent alone in her dingy motel room, haunted by the memories of what she had lost. She would often think back to the life she had shared with Brian, the love they had once had, and wonder how she could have thrown it all away. The affair with Kevin, which had seemed so thrilling and exciting at the time, now felt like a cruel joke. Kevin had disappeared from her life as soon as things went south, leaving her to pick up the pieces on her own. As the months passed, Susan began to accept the harsh reality of her situation. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The luxurious lifestyle, the security, the love she had once taken for granted, it was all gone, and there was no getting it back. Susan became a ghost of her former self, moving through life with a quiet resignation. She no longer sought to reclaim what she had lost, but simply to survive. The woman who had once been the center of Brian's world had faded into a distant memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when you betray the one person who truly loves you. Brian, on the other hand, continued to thrive. His new life was simple, but it was filled with the kind of peace and contentment he had longed for during his marriage. He no longer thought of Susan with anger or bitterness. Instead, he remembered her as someone he had once loved deeply, but who had ultimately chosen a different path.